Yeah.
Picture this, you're in Boston back in the early 60s. Yeah, 1960s. And there's this like a real sense of dread hanging over the city. A string of murders has everyone on edge.
Oh, yeah.
Headlines are screaming about the mad strangler of Boston. Even like the Phantom Fiend people are terrified to be alone in their apartments.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It's like the whole city is holding its breath, and this is the infamous Boston Strangler case, but officially it's known as the Silk Stocking Murders.
Okay.
So we're going to take a deep dive into this really chilling part of history, and we're going to be using excerpts from the Wikipedia article on the case to guide us. So we're going to try to sift through all the facts and evidence, see if we can, unravel the controversy surrounding the guy who confessed to it all, Albert DeSalvo.
Well, you know, one thing that always strikes me about this case is just the sheer variety of the victims. I mean, we're talking about 13 single women, ages 19 to 85, all murdered in their homes over a 2-year period. And it wasn't just their ages that were different, right? Their backgrounds, their ethnicities, their jobs, all over the map. It really threw a wrench into that sort of traditional understanding of serial killer profiles.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So you've got the police. They're desperately trying to connect the dots. They're looking for any kind of pattern or a motive, right? Anything to narrow down their search. But having such a diverse group of victims, that must have made it so hard to create a profile of the killer.
Oh, absolutely.
Huh.
Back then, the thinking was that serial killers were driven by these very specific fantasies,
Okay.
which meant they usually targeted a certain type.
Right.
But the Boston Strangler case really challenged that idea. It forced investigators to, think outside the box, broaden their scope.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it really added to the public's fear, too,
Yeah.
because it felt like anyone could be a target.
Right. Anyone could be next. And speaking of fear, let's talk about how the media portrayed this whole thing. I mean, going from nicknames like the Mad Strangler of Boston to the infamous Boston Strangler, that must have had a huge impact on how the public saw the case, don't you think?
Oh, for sure. The media played a huge role in shaping the narrative.
Yeah.
The newspapers were all competing for the most sensational headlines, and the term Boston Strangler, it was just so catchy.
Yeah, it sticks with you.
Right. It created this image of like a mythical figure, like a boogeyman
Mm.
hiding in the shadows of Boston. It's a classic example of how media coverage can really influence an investigation. Sometimes for the better, sometimes not.
Yeah, sometimes not. I mean, they even brought in a parapsychologist to try and crack the case.
Oh, yeah, Peter Hurkos.
Yeah.
Attorney General Edward Brick brought him in.
Wow.
He claimed to use ESP, extrasensory perception, to create a profile of the killer. Of course, he ended up pointing the finger at the wrong person. Which just shows you the dangers of relying on those unproven methods,
Yeah.
especially when you've got all that public pressure,
Right. Everyone's looking for answers. It's like a real-life detective novel, but with way higher stakes. So let's try and piece together the timeline of the murders, starting with the very first victim.
Okay, so the first known victim was 55-year-old woman named Anna Slessers.
Okay.
She was found murdered in her apartment on Gainsborough Street on June 14th, 1962.
And just like the other cases, hers had no signs of forced entry, which means she probably knew her attacker or at least felt comfortable enough to let them in. That's a chilling thought, and it must have really ramped up the fear in the city. So was she targeted, or was this a truly random act?
That is the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
That's one of the big mysteries that has haunted this case for decades.
Right.
And tragically, just a few weeks later, on June 28th, 1962, an 85-year-old woman named Mary Mullen was found murdered in her apartment on Commonwealth Avenue. Again, no signs of forced entry. The killer seemed to be striking randomly, going after women of all ages and from all walks of life.
It's heartbreaking going through this list of victims, each with their own story, their families left behind to grieve. Nina Nichols, Helen Blake, Ida, Erga Jane Sullivan. It just goes on and on.
And with each murder, it felt like the killer was getting bolder. There was this sense that he was learning, adapting, becoming more confident.
So this is where a figure who was already on the radar of law enforcement enters the picture, Albert DeSalvo. He already had a couple of nicknames, the Green Man and the Measuring Man, from his previous crimes.
And those earlier crimes are really important for understanding DeSalvo's psychology.
Okay.
He was what's called a power assurance offender. These types of criminals, they aren't necessarily driven by a desire to inflict pain.
Right.
It's more about a need for control,
Yeah.
dominance over their victims.
So how does that fit with the brutality of the Boston Strangler murders? Were these just acts of control, or was there something darker going on?
That's a question that has fueled so much debate about DeSalvo's involvement.
I bet.
Because on the one hand, you have the fact that he confessed to being the Boston Strangler.
Right.
And His concession included some very accurate details, like the blue chair detail.
Oh, yeah, that's right. That detail was never released to the public. So how could he have possibly known about it? It's like a pretty strong piece of evidence.
It does.
Hmm.
But then on the other hand, a lot of his confession didn't match the evidence found at the crime scenes.
So which is it? So it's like we're stuck in this loop, a confession and then inconsistencies and doubts and more doubts. But DeSalvo, he was sentenced to life in prison in 1967 for those earlier crimes. But the whole question of the Boston Strangler murders that just hung over him.
Oh, it definitely did. And things got even more complicated when he managed to escape prison for a little while.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. What happened?
Well, it was quite a story. He actually broke out with 2 other inmates, but the escape was short-lived.
Oh, so they caught him.
Oh yeah, they caught him pretty quickly and sent him right back to prison. But then, just a few years later, in another tragic twist, he was found stabbed to death in the prison infirmary.
Wow.
This was in 1973.
Okay.
And to make things even more mysterious, they never found his killer or killers. Another unsolved mystery layered on top of an already complicated case.
It's like every time we think we're getting close to an answer, another curveball comes our way.
Right.
It really makes you wonder what we can actually know for sure about all of this. And even after DeSalvo's death, the debate about his guilt or innocence just wouldn't go away.
Right, it really didn't.
There were a lot of people who knew him personally, including Dr. Ames Roby, the medical director at Bridgewater State Hospital, and they didn't believe he was capable of those murders.
Yeah, Dr. Roby, he actually called DeSalvo a compulsive confessor, someone who craved attention and might have even been willing to take the blame for crimes he didn't commit.
Wow, so he was like he wanted the notoriety.
That was the theory. And this theory gained traction. Even the famous FBI profiler, Johnny Douglas, he had his doubts about DeSalvo.
Really?
Based on his behavioral analysis, you see. He felt that DeSalvo's profile, it just didn't align with the level of brutality and the seemingly random nature of those stranglings.
Okay, that's interesting. And then there's Elaine Sharp, the attorney who dedicated years of her life to trying to clear DeSalvo's name.
Oh, she was amazing. She really dug deep into those case files, meticulously pointing out inconsistencies and bringing attention to key evidence. Like, for instance, the fact that there was no semen found in the final victim, Mary Sullivan's case.
Right, that's a pretty big detail to overlook. So
Yeah.
Sharp's work that really forced people to reconsider the whole story and ask some tough questions.
It did. It was like she was shining a spotlight on the cracks in the official narrative.
Yeah.
And it made people wonder, was the man who confessed to being the Boston Strangler actually innocent? Or was he involved in some of the murders, but not all of them?
So we're back to this idea of maybe multiple killers operating under this umbrella of the Boston Strangler. I mean, that's a pretty wild theory.
It is, but it's one that's been around for a long time. And when you look at all the evidence, it's not totally out there.
Right, right. So conflicting accounts, a confession that might not be totally reliable, and this growing cloud of uncertainty, it felt like the case was at a standstill.
It did, until 2013, that is. That's when things took a major turn.
What happened?
DNA testing linked DeSalvo to Mary Sullivan's murder.
Wow, so finally a breakthrough.
It really seemed like the missing piece of the puzzle had been found. I mean, a sample taken from DeSalvo's nephew, it matched the DNA found at the crime scene. And a court even ordered the exhumation of DeSalvo's body to confirm the link directly.
And did it?
The results came back in July 2013, and they officially confirmed that DeSalvo was involved in Mary Sullivan's murder.
Well, you would think that would be a case closed, right? Mystery solved.
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But as with so many things in this case, it's not that simple.
I figured as much. So what's the catch?
Well, the DNA evidence definitely gave us a clear answer in Sullivan's case.
Right.
But it also raised a whole bunch of new questions about the other murders.
Oh, I see.
Remember all that variety in the victims we talked about?
Yeah.
And the differences in how they were killed?
Yeah.
It's entirely possible, even probable, that DeSalvo was involved in some of the killings, but not all of them.
So we're back to square one with this multiple killer theory.
It's looking more and more likely, isn't it?
This case, it's like one of those really complex math problems where just when you think you've solved it, a whole new set of variables pop up.
Exactly. And it's that complexity, that element of the unknown, that has kept the Boston Strangler case alive in our minds for all these years. I mean, it's inspired books, movies, even a nickname for a basketball player,
Oh, yeah. Andrew Toney, the Boston Strangler.
Exactly. It seems like this case has really captured our collective imagination, and it's stuck with us for decades. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it taps into some of our deepest fears.
Yeah, like what's...
The idea that someone could be out there lurking in the shadows, preying on vulnerable people and getting away with it, it's
Yeah.
terrifying. It makes us question our own safety,
Right.
our sense of security.
Absolutely. And we can't forget the media's role in all of this. The way this case was reported, with all those sensational headlines and dramatic twists, it turned it into a spectacle, almost like a form of entertainment. It's a powerful reminder of how media narratives can shape our understanding of events, especially when it comes to sensitive and complicated issues like this.
Yeah, and it highlights the importance of responsible journalism,
Right,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Seeking truth and accuracy, even when there's pressure to sensationalize the story.
Yeah, that's key.
But, we also have to acknowledge the groundbreaking work of those early reporters, Gene Cole and Loretta McLaughlin.
Right.
Even though they might have contributed to the perhaps inaccurate nickname, the Boston Strangler, their reporting was really important.
Yeah, so.
They gave a voice to the victims, they shed light on the fear that gripped the city, and they really paved the way for future generations of investigative journalists.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Boston Strangler case, what are some key takeaways? I mean, with all these twists and turns, the conflicting evidence and the doubts that still linger, where do we even begin to make sense of it all?
Well, I think first and foremost, we have to acknowledge the tragic loss of those 13 women.
Of course.
Their lives were cut short, and their families are still searching for answers and justice. It's easy to get lost in the mystery, but we can't forget the human cost of these crimes.
You're absolutely right. But what about the bigger picture? What does this case tell us about our justice system, our understanding of criminal psychology, and even our own fascination with true crime?
That's a big question, and I don't think there's an easy answer.
Mm.
But one thing is for sure the Boston Strangler case. It shows us how powerful a mystery can be. It forces us to confront this uncomfortable truth, that sometimes, even with all the evidence we can gather, the truth can still remain hidden.
It's like we've been on this crazy roller coaster with this case, up and down twists and turns, and we never really know where we're going to end up. But even with that DNA evidence that connects DeSalvo to Mary Sullivan's murder, we still have so many questions that haven't been answered.
Well, that's how it goes with these kinds of complex cases.
Yeah.
They don't usually have those nice, neat, and tidy endings.
Right.
There are always loose ends and doubts that just keep hanging around. And there's always a chance that something new will come up, some new piece of information that could totally change how we see things.
So then what do we do? I mean, if we can't say for sure that DeSalvo did all those murders, does the investigation just stay open forever? Are we going to be stuck in this loop of just guessing and arguing about it?
Well, that's a really good question.
Right.
And while it's not very likely that all the answers are just going to suddenly appear, I do think we need to change our focus a little bit. What if instead of obsessing over who, we dug a little deeper into the why?
I like that. So instead of getting lost in all those details of who might have done each individual murder, we should be looking at the bigger picture.
Yeah.
What were the things going on in society back then that maybe contributed to this kind of horrific crime spree? What was it about Boston in the early 60s that created this environment of fear and vulnerability?
Exactly. We should be looking at the cultural context, what was going on back then.
Right.
And the psychology of both the victims and whoever the killer or killers might have been.
Mm.
And we shouldn't forget about how the media shapes how the public saw everything. Maybe if we explore those things, we can understand this case better.
Yeah.
Not just the Boston Strangler case,
Right.
but also bigger issues like violence, fear, even the human condition.
Yeah. It's like we've been so busy trying to find the missing pieces of the puzzle that we forgot to take a step back and see the whole picture,
Right.
And maybe that big picture with all its complexity is the real story here.
You hit the nail on the head. The Boston Strangler case isn't just about solving a crime. It's about trying to understand all the messy, complicated parts of human nature, the things we don't know, and the power that mystery has over us.
So to everyone listening, as you think about everything we've talked about today, we encourage you to go deeper than just the surface level of this case. Don't try to force a definitive answer. Just embrace the uncertainty. Think about the questions that are still in your mind. What does this case say about good and evil, the things we don't know, and the darkness that's inside all of us?
And always remember, searching for the truth is more like a journey than a destination. We may never fully solve the Boston Strangler case, but that doesn't mean it's not important. It still makes us think and question and remember that some mysteries are meant to stay with us. They make us think and fire up our imaginations.
And that's a wrap on this deep dive into the Boston Strangler case. Thanks for joining us.
It was a pleasure.